Bom, em homenagem de commencer ma conférence. I was conceived, born, and raised at Four Corners. Not Sudbury, Ontario's world-famous Four Corners, of course, and certainly not the American town of Four Corners, thus named for the reason that is the only place in the entire USA where meet four states, namely Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. No, those are not the Four Corners I speak of. I speak here of Canada's very own, one and only very recently created Four Corners, where that is now meet the provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and the territories called Northwest and Nunavut. Take that, Geography 101. Except that, of course, Nunavut came into existence only in 1999 when I was already 47, but that's another story. For another time, at another place. Northern Manitoba, in any case, is where I come from, proudly. Unfortunately, for those of you us who come from the area, when people think Northern Manitoba, they envision in a flash the port town of Churchill on the Hudson's Bay. But no, that's not where I come from. I come quite on the hand from the province's other end, that is its western extremity. So far west of Churchill that is Churchill, might as well be to us a suburb of Minsk, Belarusia. And Winnipeg so far south to us that to us it was Rio de Janeiro. Even the mining town of Tomson was, for us, as exotic and remote as Managua, Nicaragua. So far north is the land that I come from, in fact, that back in the day when I was born, which of course takes us back to the era of Genghis Khan and his wife Agnes, European languages of any kind, whatever, were unheard of. English wasn't spoken, French wasn't spoken, even Ukrainian was a complete non-presence. Not a pierogi in sight. The only human languages that were heard and spoken up in those parts, back in those days, were Aboriginal, and of these there were three: Dene, Cree, and Inuktitut. In fact, the land that I speak of was so far north that Cree, rightly speaking, didn't even belong there. Rightly speaking, the land that straddles the northern, I forgot to tell myself, otherwise I'm going to be here for 3 days. Okay, I did that one time, 3 days. Rightly speaking, the land that straddles the northern extremity of the three prairie provinces and the southern extremities of the Northwest Nunavut and Yukon territories was Dene territory. Cree, by comparison, came, as it still does, from the south, relatively speaking. From that is the central portion of the three prairie provinces and, of course, the northern halves of Ontario and Quebec. My father, Joe Highway, may he rest in peace, came from a First Nation called Pelican Narrows, which lies just inside Saskatchewan from Manitoba and some 100 kilometers north and slightly west of the border mining town of Flin Flon, Manitoba. As a young man, not yet 20, he went to work as an oarsman for the yoke boat sent to the far north by the Hudson's Bay Company to trade with the Indians. And when he laid eyes for the first time on the barren lands of what was then still just the Northwest Territories, he was smitten. And that was that. At that point in his life, he became a Northern Manitoban and stayed so for the rest of his life. And the First Nation of which he eventually became a registered member, the territory of which is called Barren Lands, the village of which is called Brochet. Though this First Nation lay not quite in the barrens of Nunavut, then it lay just south of them, just inside, that is, the province of Manitoba, where it meets his native Saskatchewan. And though we had a house in the village of Brochet, we in reality spent very little time there. What we did was out on the land, a remarkable land, a beautiful land, a land not seen to this day by the most adventurous of Europeans. With a fur trader, a missionary, prospector, cartographer, or Avon saleswoman. A land populated by great herds of caribou and filled to surfeit by 1,000 crystal-watered lakes with 10,000 islands, ringed by beaches as stunning as Brazil's, and rivers and waterfalls and eskers, and very low forests of spruce and pine and birch and willow. And by Dene, an Athabascan people whose presence on that land goes back eons. Making the 12 brown offspring of Joe and Pelagia Highway, Cree Indian children who had the privilege of growing up in Denetory with Dene children, making us bilingual right from birth. The older children more so than the youngest, for I am the 11th of those 12. As a nomadic people, our wanderings varied. There were years, for example, when we traveled further north, always by dog sled in winter, canoe in summer, back in those days. And then there were years when we stayed, where we stayed closer to our home base of Brochet, In fact, before I was born, that is to say, when my parents were younger, had fewer children, and thus were more mobile, those wanderings sometimes took us so far north that we were beyond Manitoba and well into Nunavut, where we met and mingled with yet another Aboriginal people, the peaceful Inuit, with their sealskin costumes, their houses made of ice, and their own dances such as the twist. So that in this way did their language enter our lexicon. Inuktitut, this language is called. In fact, so close did our lives eventually intertwine with theirs that intermarriage happened on a basis semi-regular, resulting in the fact that to this day I have relatives who are part Inuit, and Inuktitut was heard when I was growing up right there in Brochet. So there we were, Joe and Pelagia Highway's brood, the privileged children of three native languages, each is distinct one from the other, as English is from Arabic and Korean, or French is from Mandarin or Swahili. For Cree, like Ojibwe and Blackfoot, is an Algonquian language. Dene, like Slavey and Dogrib, Athabascan, and Inuktitut in a linguistic family, all on its own, kind of like Hungarian is in Europe, let us say. Between these three native languages, that is to say, there is not a stitch of similarity, not a syllable in common, and English was to come much later, as was French. In fact, the first European language that I was to learn, as it turns out, was neither. It was Latin, whereby hangs a tale of monstrous extravagance. I'm sorry, I get carried away. The English, I'm still learning it. Every day I learn a new word. Every day I add a new word to my vocabulary. Be that as it may, if we were bilingual in Cree and Dene, it was Dad who spoke Inuktitut, not us. But be that as it may, if we were bilingual in Cree and Dene, then so was Brochet. At the north end of this village that never numbered more than 800 people lived the status in Cree. At its south, the non-status Cree, as it being Cree to begin with was not complicated enough already. In between these two split communities lived the Dene, so that just to cross from one side of the village to the other, for we were status who happened to have relatives who had married non-status, for we were one had to change language not once but twice. Once from Dene to Cree to Dene when we walked through the Dene neighborhood and the dogs barked at us in Dene and we had to bark back in Dene. And once from Dene back to Cree when we reached the other side. So that by the time you arrived at your Aunt Emily's, your tongue was exhausted. Changing linguistic gears on a dime like that will do that to you.